everybody, Mark Watts here. In this installment I want to show you the relationship between f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO and how they affect your pictures and what we can do to take better pictures by knowing about these numbers. So let's get started. Alright, here we have the typical exposure triangle that's used to show the relationship between shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO. At the top we have our shutter speed, and this is the amount of time we let the light enter our lens, and it goes from 1/4 of a second to 1/3000th of a second. Over on the right side we have our f-stop, and this is our aperture inside our lens, and it opens and closes. It starts off at a small hole and gets bigger, and we can control it. Actually, the 1.4 is the larger aperture, and it goes down to f22 and gets smaller, and this controls our depth of field. Over on our left side we have our ISO, and this is the sensitivity of our sensor. It used to be our film, but since the digital world we have a sensor, and it goes from 100 to 12800, and as you increase the number from 100 to 12800, you induce more noise into every picture you take. So you really want to have lower ISOs. So if you select one of each of these and it moves, our ISO goes from 800 to 400, that's one stop or one step. But notice that the numbers on our f-stop, they don't cut in half or double every step. It takes a jump of 2 to make one stop. So same with our shutter speed, is one stop or one step. It goes from 1/500 to 1/1000th of a second. So to get this perfect exposure, we have to select one of each of these numbers. And in this case, we're starting off with an f-stop of 5.6. Typically on your long lenses used for like bird photography or nature photography, sporting, you have a 5.6 lens, and this is the lowest setting you can go on your f-stop because there is no f4 2.8 unless you buy an expensive lens, in which case they're big, heavy, and like I say, most important, expensive. So typically I set mine at 5.6 and I never change it. And if we go from 1/500th of a second to 1/1000th of a second, then our ISO has to increase from 400 to 800. If we go to 1/2000th, one step to 2000, our ISO has to go one step or one stop increase. And if we go down to 1/250th of a second, then our ISO has to go 3 steps. So that's what we need to get a perfect exposure. We get the perfect exposure, but with different numbers. So what is this photo noise I mentioned? Well, in this picture here we have a greater Kiskadee I caught down in South Texas, and it was an ISO of 6000, and you can see the little specks and dots in the background picture. This is digital noise, or dirt as some of us call it. You want to have the least amount you can have, but thankfully due to technology and software, we can now process our pictures with denoise software, and it will clean up a lot of this. And it's a matter of knowing what ISO you can clean up. I can't go above about 6000 ISO. After that, the picture's not usable. So why is shutter speed so important? Well, if you take a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second at ISO 400 and this bird flies in, we take his picture, we get this motion blur. And it's either because of the movement or the bird, or it could be the camera shake that you induce into moving around and taking the picture. Whereas if you increase the shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second, your ISO goes up to 800 and you get less motion blur in the picture. So if you increase it again to like 1/2000th of a second, your ISO increases up to 1600 and you get these tack sharp images. So the higher the shutter speed, lower the ISO. That's what you're looking for. So what I do is I shoot what's called manual mode with auto ISO. I've already selected my f-stop. I know I want to have a high shutter speed, and I let the camera choose the ISO, and I just have to watch it and adjust my shutter speed accordingly to get it the proper exposure. In this example here, we're shooting on a bright sunny day, and the bird flies in, we're at an ISO of 400. That's real nice. But if that bird flies under a tree or the clouds move over, then we're still at 1/2000th of a second. Our ISO goes to 1000. The bird flies in, we get a tack sharp image again. So even out in the woods, a lot of times when you're out in the woods shooting, you wind up with a 1/2000th second and an ISO of 4000. And you take the picture and you get more noise induced into the picture. But if you watch your shutter speed and watch your ISO and adjust your shutter speed to keep your ISO manageable, you'll get great pictures. Okay, here's some examples of this right here. Let's say that this white-tailed hawk flying around, I caught this down in South Texas, and you can see the noise in the picture at ISO 500. Well, he flew around and he was circling, catching thermals, and he caught the blue sky in the background. Well, you can see that this ISO increased to 800, and you can see the noise in it. It's a little bit bigger specks. So this is our noise. So a lot of times you're out shooting and you come across a white bird, and I have to adjust my exposure compensation with auto ISO. I have a button on the back of the camera. I mash the button, and then I can scroll back and forth to increase or decrease the compensation, and it does it in stops. So in this case here, we have this white pelican, and we know we're going to be shooting at a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. Our ISO goes to 800. We get these blinkies because I have my zebra striping turned on in my camera, and it alerts me through the viewfinder that I'm overexposing for the whites. So what I do is I hit my button on the bottom, and then I can expose it a half step or third step down to -1 step. But notice that the ISO, every time I decrease my exposure compensation down to -1 now, my ISO went down. So this is great because you're still keeping your shutter speed up and lowering your ISO at the same time. But sometimes you have to shoot into the sun at a subject, and your camera sees all this light coming in, and it exposes for the scene and not for the subject. In this case, I increased my exposure compensation up to +1, and my ISO increased at the same time. So let's see some examples of this. Here's a snowy egret sitting here, and I'm taking this picture. Maybe it's a great white egret. Who can tell? You can only tell if you see the feet. No, not really. It helps if you got golden slippers, so you know it's a snowy egret then. But anyway, we're at ISO 250. And you can see in this area here that the whites are blown out a little bit. And as I go through these slides, look at the background. The background gets a little bit darker every time I exposure compensate -0.3 to -0.7 to -1. Now, -1 is about my favorite number to use. I usually go straight to -1 and take the picture. And when you do this, you start getting more details in the feathers. In this example here, I went even further, -1.7, and you can actually see some of the shadow lines in the feathers, the reflection off of the water. And this example here is at -2. So a lot of times you have to shoot into the sun. Well, here is an example right here. I'm at 1/4000th of a second. Why I'm shooting so fast at a small subject not flying, I don't know, but this example is ISO 2000. And you see this American bittern here, and you really can't see any detail in it. So what I did was I overexposed for the subject, and I went up and +1.7 exposure compensation. And look at the colors and the detail, the little wisping in the feathers. It really turned out good. So remember, auto ISO, and when you see subjects in certain situations, you don't even have to take your eye off the viewfinder. You just move your thumb down, push the button, scroll the wheel. So it's a good place to be. I want to thank everybody for watching my video series. If you like them, please hit the like button. I love to hear some feedback. I'm not getting any feedback, and I want to know what you guys want to see and what you need to learn. So y'all have a great day.